At my wife's funeral, my daughter-in-law rejoiced, but she cried when the will was read, and that single truth has burned itself into my memory forever. You see, grief has many faces, but never in my life did I think I would see joy on the face of the woman who had married my son, joy in the very moment when my wife, the woman who had given her nothing but kindness and generosity, was being laid to rest. I stood there, staring at the casket draped in white lilies. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. My heart breaking in ways I cannot even begin to describe, and yet beyond the tears, beyond the murmurs of condolences, I caught sight of her smile. It was not the kind of smile that comes from a bittersweet memory or the relief of a soul at peace. No, it was the smug, victorious curl of lips belonging to someone who believed that death had unlocked a door to their own fortune. And in that moment, as my wife's body lay cold and still, I realized that the person I had welcomed into my family with open arms had been waiting for this day, celebrating it in her heart while I stood there broken. It was a cruel betrayal hidden in plain sight. As relatives hugged me, their tears soaking into my suit, I kept glancing at her. She tried to hide it with feigned sobs, dabbing her eyes with tissues that never caught a real tear, but I saw it clearly. The gleam in her eyes, the almost imperceptible lift in her chin, as though she were already claiming victory. She was not grieving a loss. She was savoring what she thought was the beginning of her gain. And perhaps what wounded me most was not just her behavior, but the knowledge that my wife, who had treated her like her own daughter, would never know how little gratitude, how little respect had existed in that heart. I clenched my hands tightly around the pew, the polished wood groaning under my grip, and I asked myself silently how much more insult could be piled onto my sorrow. What kind of person finds pleasure in another's death, especially in the death of a woman who had raised a son strong enough to become her husband? But there she was, standing proud in her black dress, whispering to another relative with the faintest laugh muffled behind her hand. Every glance she stole at me seemed to carry the same message. She thought she had won. Yet as I stood there, swallowing my rage, burying my pain beneath the mask of a grieving husband, I knew that what she did not know was that my wife and I had seen this possibility long before the sickness claimed her life. My wife had been a wise woman, and she had insisted that the future be safeguarded, that no ungrateful hand should squander the lifetime of labor we had poured into our family. My daughter-in-law may have thought that day was her triumph, but she did not yet know that the true moment of reckoning was waiting for her when the will was read. And when that moment came, it would not be joy on her face but tears. That day, the smile she wore at my wife's funeral would be wiped away forever. The weight of grief filled the room like a suffocating fog, heavy and unrelenting, pressing against my chest with every breath I took. And yet, as unbearable as that sorrow was, nothing pierced me more deeply than the sight of her twisted joy. The air smelled faintly of lilies and incense, the traditional fragrance of mourning, but to me it stank of betrayal. Every sob that echoed around the hall, every hushed murmur of sympathy from old friends and distant relatives only amplified the bitter contrast of her demeanor. Where others wept, she smirked. Where others prayed, she whispered in hushed tones that carried the unmistakable lilt of amusement. My wife lay in her coffin, serene, her body dressed in the gown she had chosen years ago for this very occasion, her face as peaceful as if she were merely sleeping. And yet my gaze kept being pulled away from her, to the woman who stood a few rows back, clutching her handbag as if it contained her future, her lips curling ever so slightly in satisfaction. It was an expression I could never mistake, for I had seen that same look on her before, whenever she thought she had won something undeserved. Now she wore it in the sacred presence of death, mocking not only me but also the memory of the woman who had treated her like a daughter. Grief had carved itself into my bones, but anger had started to seep through the cracks, cold and sharp. I watched her, pretending to wipe tears that never fell, and I knew in that instant that her performance was not for my wife, not for my family, not even for the guests gathered there. It was for herself, an act to veil the quiet celebration she harbored in her heart. She believed this death marked the opening of a vault, a fortune ready to be claimed. And though no one else seemed to notice, I saw it as clearly as if she had shouted her triumph aloud. My heart clenched painfully at the thought that my wife's years of kindness had been wasted on someone so undeserving. The grief that surrounded me felt like drowning in dark water, but what cut deepest was the certainty that my daughter-in-law's joy was not only real, but rooted in the hope that everything we had built, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar saved, would now be hers to squander. That knowledge was the cruelest wound of all, sharper than any blade, heavier than any burden. And it was in that realization that sorrow began to turn into something else entirely, something that would not let me rest until justice was done. When I think back on the years that my wife and I spent building our family, it is like watching a film reel of sacrifice unspooling slowly in my mind, each frame marked with sweat, struggle, and unshakable devotion. We were young once, filled with dreams that stretched far beyond the four corners of the small house we built together, but we set those dreams aside the moment we held our first child in our arms. I remember nights when my wife sewed clothes by the dim glow of a lamp long after everyone had gone to bed, her fingers raw and sore, but her spirit unwavering because she wanted our children to look presentable even when money was scarce. I remember mornings when I left for work before the sun had risen and returned long after it had set, my body aching from labor but my heart soothed by the laughter that greeted me at the door. We gave everything we could, not just in money, but in time, in love, in every opportunity we could scrape together from a world that was never eager to give. While others took vacations and bought luxuries, we saved every cent for our children's education, for their futures, for a stability we ourselves had never known. There were days when we could barely afford meat on the table, when my wife would pretend she was not hungry so the children could eat a little more, and yet she always smiled, always told me it was worth it. We built more than a home. We built a foundation out of sacrifice and unwavering patience, laying each stone with care so that those who came after us would not have to walk the same rough road. And for years, I believed that foundation had meaning, that the children we raised would see and remember, would carry forward the values we poured into them. My wife and I gave up trips we longed to take, businesses we might have built, and comforts we might have enjoyed, all because we thought it would matter more to give the next generation a chance at something greater. She was the heart of it all, my wife, the one who reminded me on the hardest nights that our pain was only temporary, that one day we would see our children live the lives we never could. Looking back, I see her sacrifices etched into every corner of our history, sacrifices that should have been honored, cherished, and remembered. And it was this very history, this tapestry of devotion and selflessness, that made the sight of my daughter-in-law's joy at her funeral so unbearable. for it mocked every ounce of suffering we had endured to give our family a better life. From the very beginning, there was something about my son's wife that unsettled me. Though out of love for him and respect for the vows he had taken, I forced myself to welcome her into our family with open arms. She was polished on the outside, her smile bright, her words dripping with charm whenever she wanted something, but behind that mask lay an arrogance so sharp it cut through every attempt at kindness. She came from a family that valued appearances above character, and from the moment she first stepped into our modest home, I could see the disdain in her eyes. She looked at our worn furniture, at the photographs of our years of hard work, and I could feel her silent judgment, as though she thought her presence elevated us, as though she believed she was doing us a favor by marrying into our family. Over the years, her greed began to reveal itself in countless little ways, disguised at first as suggestions, then demands, then outright contempt. Birthdays and holidays were never about togetherness for her, only about the gifts she expected, the money she hinted we should provide, the lifestyle she thought she deserved. I watched as she prodded my son into spending beyond his means, chasing material things while dismissing the values his mother and I had worked so hard to instill. She would roll her eyes whenever my wife spoke about our struggles in raising the family, dismissing decades of sacrifice as though they were meaningless stories from a past beneath her. At gatherings, she treated us not as elders to be respected, but as obstacles in her path, barriers to the wealth and status she craved. And the more years passed, the more brazen her disrespect became. She mocked our frugality, sneered at our traditions, and whispered to others about how old-fashioned we were, not realizing or not caring that we could hear. She was the kind of person who measured worth in possessions, who believed love was proven by how much money could be spent, and it broke my wife's heart to see our son's life so heavily influenced by her. My wife, always gentle, always forgiving, tried tirelessly to reach her, to show her compassion, to treat her as a daughter despite the coldness she gave in return. But nothing softened her greed, nothing could humble her sense of entitlement. In our later years, when respect should have been our children's gift to us, it was her scorn that filled our days instead. And as I stood at my wife's funeral, seeing that same entitled woman allow her joy to shine through her false grief, I understood clearly what she had become in our story. Not just a daughter-in-law, but the root of the deepest disrespect we had ever endured. Standing by my wife's coffin, surrounded by the sorrowful hush of the mourners, I was struck by a truth so bitter it nearly drove me to my knees. My daughter-in-law did not just lack respect for us. She held us in open contempt, and that realization cut deeper than the grief of death itself. I had always known she looked down on us, always felt the sting of her disdain hidden behind practiced smiles and insincere words. But there, in the stillness of that funeral hall, I finally saw the depth of her scorn with unbearable clarity. As I looked down at my wife's lifeless face, her features softened by the gentle work of those who had prepared her body, I thought of all the kindness she had shown, all the patience she had offered, all the love she had poured into the family we built. And yet across the room was the woman who should have been mourning, who should have felt gratitude for the years of generosity we extended, and instead she exuded a kind of triumph that sickened me. It shattered me, because it was not only her betrayal, but also the knowledge that my wife never lived to see this truth as I saw it then. My wife believed until the very end that love and compassion could change even the coldest of hearts, that one day our daughter-in-law would see us for who we were rather than for what we could give. She went to her grave hoping for reconciliation, clinging to the belief that her son had chosen a partner who would eventually grow to understand the meaning of family. But as I stood there, watching the faint upturn of lips that should have been trembling with grief, I knew that hope had died with her. The woman my son had brought into our family did not see us as people to love or respect. She saw us as obstacles, stepping stones, wallets, providers, and now that my wife was gone, she saw only the inheritance she believed she was entitled to seize. I tightened my grip on the edge of the coffin, the polished wood biting into my palm, and the weight of that realization crushed me. All the sacrifices, all the silent endurance of her insults, all the efforts to build a bridge where she only sought to burn them, it had all been for nothing in her eyes. She had despised us all along, and in that moment I felt the last fragile thread of illusion snap inside me. My grief was no longer pure. It was stained with the venom of betrayal, and as much as it shattered me to accept it, I could no longer deny the depth of her contempt. Later that evening, when the mourners had gone and the house had settled into the heavy silence that follows a funeral, I slipped away from the crowd of lingering relatives to find a moment alone. My heart was already raw, torn open by the grief of losing my wife and the bitter realization that my daughter-in-law's smile at the coffin was no accident. I thought perhaps a few minutes of solitude would give me strength, but fate had other plans. As I passed by the guest room door, slightly ajar, I froze at the sound of her voice drifting through, sharp and laced with venom. I leaned closer, the words slicing through me with every syllable. "Finally," she said, her tone almost gleeful, "finally, all that money, all that property, all that effort they hoarded will be ours. He won't hold on much longer, and then everything will fall into our hands. Can you imagine? I'll never have to put up with their pitiful stories again." My chest tightened as though the air itself had been poisoned. She was speaking to someone on the phone, her guard down, her cruelty laid bare, mocking the sacrifices my wife and I had made as if they were foolish burdens, laughing at the very foundation of our lives. "All those years of them playing the martyrs," she continued with a low chuckle, "working themselves to the bone, saving every penny, acting like saints. Well, it's finally paying off, isn't it? For us, not for them." Her voice dripped with entitlement, every word a dagger twisted deeper. My hand trembled against the wall, my body torn between barging in and screaming at her, and standing silently to let the horror of her true nature burn into me. She spoke of my wife as if she had been nothing but a gatekeeper to wealth, not the heart of this family, not the woman who had loved her like a daughter. "He's old," she added casually, her laughter chilling, "and soon I'll have all of it under my control. Just wait. We'll finally live the way we deserve." Deserve. That word echoed in my skull like thunder. What had she ever done to deserve what we had built with blood and sacrifice? She had mocked us, disrespected us, treated us as relics beneath her, and yet in her twisted mind she believed the fruits of our labor rightfully belonged to her. As I stood there, the cruel words branding themselves into my memory, a fire began to kindle beneath my grief. Until then, I had been a man broken by sorrow, but in that moment I felt something shift inside me. The pain remained, but it sharpened into something else, something cold and resolute. She thought she knew the future, thought she would soon hold the fortune my wife and I had earned with our very lives, but she had no idea of the truth that was waiting for her. Was all our sacrifice in vain? That question gnawed at me relentlessly as I sat in the dim light of the empty living room, the walls heavy with silence, the air still thick with the scent of funeral flowers. My mind drifted back to every long night my wife and I had endured, every dream we had placed aside so our children could thrive, every meal we had skipped so theirs could be full. We had believed in kindness, in generosity, in the power of selflessness to shape good hearts and strong lives. But as I replayed the cruel smirk on my daughter-in-law's face at the funeral and the venomous words I had overheard dripping from her lips later that night, I felt the foundations of that belief crumble beneath me. Had we been blind all along? Had our sacrifices only raised a family where ingratitude could flourish like weeds choking the garden we tended with such care? I asked myself if kindness had become a breeding ground for vultures, scavengers who circled patiently above, waiting for the moment when death or weakness would let them swoop in to feast. My heart ached at the thought that perhaps we had given too much, that in shielding our children from hardship, we had allowed them to forget the value of struggle. And now, standing in the shadow of my wife's coffin, I was forced to confront the possibility that her years of tenderness, her tireless love, her endless faith in others had been squandered on someone who had never deserved it. The betrayal was not only in my daughter-in-law's laughter, not only in her shameless hunger for what she thought would soon be hers, but in the quiet realization that she represented everything we had fought against. My wife and I had built a life rooted in humility and hard work, yet here stood a woman tied to our family by marriage who mocked those very virtues as weaknesses. I clenched my fists and wondered if perhaps we had been too generous, too forgiving, too willing to overlook the warning signs. Was this the reward for decades of sacrifice, that the one who had shown us nothing but disdain would now dance on the grave of the woman who had sacrificed the most? The pain of that thought was unbearable, a storm raging inside me, tearing apart the fragile illusions I had clung to. And yet beneath the storm there was something else beginning to stir, a steel-like resolve hardening within me. If kindness had bred vultures, then perhaps it was time to show that even the most patient man, the most giving husband, the most forgiving father, could rise from grief with a vengeance. My wife's memory deserved justice, and I would not allow her sacrifices to be mocked, erased, or devoured by the ungrateful. That night, as the house settled into silence, and the last of the mourners finally drifted away, I sat alone with my grief, staring at the chair where my wife had so often rested, her hands busy with sewing, or her soft voice carrying through the room as she read aloud to the grandchildren. The emptiness of that chair was unbearable, a hollow reminder of what I had lost, and yet, as I sat there drowning in sorrow, something within me began to shift. Grief had been my constant companion since the moment she slipped from this world, but now it began to harden into something else, something cold and unyielding. I realized with perfect clarity that my wife deserved more than tears. She deserved justice, not only for her memory, but for every sacrifice she had made and every slight she had endured from the ungrateful woman who dared to smirk at her coffin. My daughter-in-law believed she had won, believed she would soon control the fortune my wife and I had built with our sweat and pain, but her cruelty, her arrogance, her utter contempt had ignited something inside me that could not be extinguished. I began to see the path ahead, not through the haze of mourning, but with the sharpness of strategy. I replayed her words, her mocking laughter, her callous greed, and I knew that I could not allow her to claim victory over my wife's legacy. My wife had trusted me to safeguard our family, trusted me to stand as the protector of all we had built, and in that moment I vowed I would not fail her. I would not let our years of sacrifice be reduced to trophies in the hands of an ingrate. I straightened in my chair, my tears drying on my face as resolve took their place. I thought of the will we had carefully drawn up, of the meetings we had held in secret with our lawyer, of the quiet assurances my wife had whispered when we signed those papers that our grandchildren's future would be protected. She had believed in that plan, and now it was my duty to see it through. Grief would no longer paralyze me. It would become my weapon, tempered into a resolve so precise it would cut through the lies and entitlement that had poisoned my family. My daughter-in-law thought she was clever, thought she had already won, but she had not reckoned with the strength of a man who had lost everything yet still had one last promise to keep. My grief transformed into purpose that night, and with it came a calm, methodical determination. I would wait, I would watch, and when the moment came, I would ensure that justice was done not with rage or violence, but with truth, with law, and with the undeniable weight of everything my wife and I had worked for. Long before sickness dimmed the light in my wife's eyes, long before the day came when I had to stand over her coffin and face the smug joy of my daughter-in-law, we had prepared for this very moment. My wife was wise in ways that often startled me, always seeing beyond the surface, always sensing truths that others tried to conceal. She had once confessed to me, late at night when the house was quiet and we lay side by side, that she feared what would become of our life's work after we were gone. She had noticed, as I had, the disdain in our daughter-in-law's glances, the greed in her words, the dismissive tone she used when speaking about the very things we had poured our lives into. My wife worried not for herself, but for the legacy we wanted to leave behind, the home we had built with our own hands, the savings we had accumulated penny by penny, the land that carried the weight of generations of struggle. She feared it would all be squandered, sold off to fund frivolous indulgences, stripped of its meaning and turned into nothing more than currency for someone who had never respected its value. And so, together, quietly and carefully, we went to see lawyers. We sat across from them in polished offices, our modest clothes and tired faces a stark contrast to the gleaming desks and sharp suits, and we laid bare our fears. They listened, they asked questions, they explained options, and in the end, they helped us craft a plan that would safeguard everything we had built. It was not about revenge at the time, it was about love, about protection, about ensuring that our sacrifices would truly benefit those who deserved it most. The will we created was detailed and deliberate, leaving no room for manipulation, no gaps for greed to slip through. The majority of our estate, the land, the home, the savings, all of it was placed in trust for our grandchildren so that they might have a future secured from the reckless hands of those who did not value it. Smaller provisions were made for others in the family, enough to show thoughtfulness and fairness, but nothing that could be twisted into an entitlement for those who sought only to take. I remember the relief on my wife's face the day we signed the final documents, her shoulders easing as though a great weight had been lifted. "Now I can rest," she told me, her hand warm in mine, "because I know they will be safe, and what we've built won't be destroyed." At the time, I did not fully grasp how vital that plan would become, but standing there at her funeral, watching my daughter-in-law's triumphant smile, I realized that my wife had seen this day long before it arrived. She had given me not just a safeguard but a weapon, a final shield to protect our legacy and a final strike against the ingratitude that threatened to consume it. And as I remembered that hidden plan, a calm certainty settled over me. I would see it through to the very end. The morning after the funeral, when the echoes of sorrow still lingered in the walls of the house and my body felt heavy with the weight of both grief and betrayal, I forced myself to put one foot in front of the other and walk into the office of the man who had become not only my lawyer, but also a silent guardian of my wife's last wishes. His name was Mr. Callahan, a man of quiet strength with sharp eyes that missed nothing, the kind of professional who carried himself with calm precision, and as I sat down across from him in his leather chair, I felt the faintest flicker of steadiness return to me. He opened the thick folder that contained our will, the very plan my wife and I had built in secrecy, and he reminded me in that measured, confident tone that the work we had done together was airtight. Every clause had been thought through, every loophole sealed, every potential manipulation accounted for. "You don't need to worry," he told me firmly, his gaze holding mine as though he could see the storm raging inside me. "Your wife was very clear about her intentions, and the documents reflect that clarity. There is no way your daughter-in-law or anyone else with selfish intentions can undo what has already been signed, notarized, and protected by law." I nodded slowly, my hands trembling as I clasped them together, feeling a surge of gratitude for my wife's foresight and for this man's skill. I told him about the things I had seen, the mocking smile at the coffin, the cruel words I had overheard in the quiet of the night, and though his expression remained professional, I caught a flicker of disdain cross his features. "I've dealt with greed before," he said, closing the folder with finality, "but what you've described is something uglier. Rest assured, she will not find what she is expecting when the will is read, and when the truth comes out, it will be undeniable." His certainty settled over me like armor, a reminder that I was not alone in this battle. My wife had not only left me with her strength and her plan, but had also ensured that men like Mr. Callahan would stand beside me to see it through. As I left his office that day, walking out into the cool air, I felt my grief no less, but I also felt it transforming further into resolve. I was no longer a man drowning in sorrow. I was a man carrying out the final wishes of his wife, armed with the assurance that the legacy we had built together was untouchable. My daughter-in-law thought she was clever, thought she had already secured her prize, but thanks to the competence of our lawyer and the wisdom of my wife, I knew that the day of reckoning was not far away, and when it came, her arrogance would collapse under the weight of truth. In the days following the funeral, as relatives came and went with casseroles and condolences, I kept mostly to myself, the mask of the grieving widower shielding the storm that brewed within me. But even in my silence, my eyes were sharp, and they saw everything. My daughter-in-law, cloaked in black and feigned sorrow, moved through the rooms of my house like a queen surveying her kingdom, her voice lowered to whispers only when she thought I was near, yet never low enough to hide the arrogance that dripped from her words. I watched her boast to a cousin about the changes she planned to make once everything was in her name, speaking as if my wife's death had merely been the unlocking of a door to riches she had always deserved. She laughed softly, that same cruel little laugh I had heard through the crack of the guest room door, and I caught fragments of her promises, new cars, expensive trips, a bigger house in the city, as though the sacrifices that had built this home, this land, this life, were nothing more than a pile of coins waiting to be spent. My grief curdled into something darker each time I heard her, and yet I remained silent, watching, letting her arrogance paint the picture of her downfall before the time came. There was a grim irony in it, a cruel poetry to the way she flaunted her imagined victory under the very roof my wife and I had built with our bare hands, oblivious to the fact that the foundations beneath her feet were already set to crumble. I let her laugh. I let her whisper. I let her lean in close to her circle of friends with that gleam in her eye as she spoke about her future, because I knew the truth she did not. She thought herself clever, thought herself already triumphant, but I knew that when the lawyer's voice carried across the room at the reading of the will, her every boast would turn to ash in her mouth. And so I watched her quietly, my silence not the silence of defeat but the silence of patience, a hunter waiting in the shadows, knowing that the moment of confrontation was coming and that her greed, so loudly displayed, would make her humiliation all the greater when the truth was finally revealed. The reception after the funeral was meant to be a time of remembrance, a gathering where stories of my wife's kindness and warmth could bring some comfort to those she had touched. Yet all I could see was the way my daughter-in-law carried herself, as though she were already the mistress of everything my wife and I had built. She moved from group to group, her posture tall, her jewelry glinting in the low light, her smile practiced and polished, like a politician's, not the smile of someone who had just lost a mother figure. She spoke with the ease of ownership, gesturing toward the house as if it already belonged to her, describing in casual tones how she might redecorate, how the old furniture might be replaced, how the land could be put to better use. Her words dripped with entitlement, each phrase another dagger twisting into my heart, but I kept my silence. Guests nodded politely, perhaps mistaking her arrogance for confidence, but I caught the way some glanced uneasily in my direction, as though they wondered why she was already speaking of a future that should not yet concern her. I stood apart, my hands folded, my face a mask of grief that concealed the anticipation coiling inside me like a spring. Every boast she made, every careless word about what she would do with her inheritance only deepened the irony of what awaited her. I could feel my wife's presence in that moment, her wisdom and foresight echoing in my memory, and it steadied me. My daughter-in-law paraded herself as if the ink of destiny had already been signed in her favor, but I knew the truth that lay sealed in the documents Mr. Callahan guarded. I let her have her moment, let her shine in her false triumph, because I knew that soon enough her arrogance would crumble to dust. The reception was her stage, but I was the audience, silent and watchful, knowing that the final act had yet to begin. My silence was not weakness, it was patience sharpened into a weapon, and while she flaunted herself like the owner of a kingdom, I carried the secret that would shatter her illusions when the will was finally read. The day of the will reading arrived with a heaviness that seemed to cling to the very walls of the lawyer's office, the kind of silence that carries both grief and expectation. And as we all gathered around the polished wooden table, I could feel the tension rising like a storm just before it breaks. The room was filled with family members, some solemn, some nervous, and one woman whose eyes gleamed with thinly veiled triumph. My daughter-in-law sat upright, her chin slightly lifted, her hand resting on my son's arm in a gesture meant to look tender but that reeked of possession, her fingers tapping impatiently as though she could already feel the weight of wealth in her hands. I said nothing, merely folded my hands in my lap and watched as Mr. Callahan, calm and meticulous as ever, opened the sealed folder that contained my wife's final words, her last act of love and justice. The crackle of the envelope tearing open seemed louder than it should have been, like a drumbeat announcing the approach of destiny, and I saw several heads tilt forward unconsciously, the entire family holding its breath. My heart pounded, not with fear but with anticipation, because I knew what was written inside. I knew that the illusion my daughter-in-law had built for herself was about to be torn apart, and still I kept my expression solemn, masking the resolve beneath. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read, his voice steady and authoritative, the words filling the room with a gravity that stilled even the fidgeting of the children in the corner. Every sentence carried the weight of my wife's foresight, every phrase a thread in the tapestry she had woven to protect what we had built. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her lips parted in the faintest smile, her eyes glinting as if each word were confirmation of her imagined inheritance. She believed she was moments away from victory, moments away from seizing control of everything my wife and I had worked for. But as the lawyer continued, the atmosphere in the room thickened, the suspense twisting tighter around us all. I could feel the eyes of the family shifting between him and me as though they sensed something beyond the surface, something brewing beneath the solemn ritual. And in that charged silence, as the will reading began in earnest, I held on to the knowledge that soon the truth would strike like lightning, and the face that had once smiled at my wife's coffin would finally be stripped of its mask. Mr. Callahan's voice carried through the room with measured authority as he began to announce the first of the bequests, small tokens of remembrance to relatives who had touched our lives in one way or another. And though each gift was modest, it was delivered with the dignity and care my wife had intended. A niece was given a collection of jewelry that had belonged to my wife's mother. A cousin received a carefully chosen painting that had hung in our home for decades. An old friend was left a sum of money set aside to help with his medical expenses. Each detail, each thoughtful gesture, was a testament to my wife's generosity and her desire to honor those who had been part of her journey. And yet, as the lawyer read on, I could feel the air shifting near me, could sense the growing smugness radiating from my daughter-in-law as she sat with her head slightly tilted, her lips curving into that greedy smirk that made my stomach twist. With every small inheritance announced, her smile grew wider, as though she believed each modest gift was one step closer to the inevitable reveal of the vast fortune she was certain awaited her. She tapped her fingers lightly against the polished table, her eyes glinting with anticipation, her entire posture one of someone barely containing her glee. I could see her imagining the moment she would be named the primary heir, the moment she would rise above everyone else in the room with the power of ownership and control. My son sat beside her, quieter, more subdued, but her energy drowned him out, her arrogance filling the room like a poison cloud. She glanced around occasionally, her smirk lingering on those who had received their tokens, as if to say, "Enjoy your crumbs, the feast belongs to me." My heart ached at the mockery of it, because those small inheritances had been given with such love and thought, yet she dismissed them as meaningless, irrelevant, compared to the treasure she thought she was about to seize. I remained silent, my face impassive, but inside me the anticipation grew sharper with every word the lawyer read, because I knew what was coming. I knew that the smile stretching across her face was destined to collapse into something very different. Still, I let her revel in her illusions, let her bask in the false light of her imagined victory, because the higher she lifted herself on the fragile pedestal of greed, the harder she would fall when the truth struck. And so the lawyer continued, his voice steady, the room hushed, every relative listening intently, while across the table one woman smiled as though she had already claimed everything, not realizing that the ground beneath her was about to vanish. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Callahan turned the page, his tone steady, deliberate, the kind of voice that carried finality with every syllable, and I knew the moment had come. My daughter-in-law sat straighter in her chair, her hand tightening around my son's arm, her smirk widening with the certainty of her imagined triumph, and then the lawyer's words cut through the silence like a blade. The majority of the estate, including the family home, the adjoining land, and the savings accumulated over a lifetime of labor, is to be placed in a trust accessible only to the grandchildren upon reaching adulthood. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment there was no sound but the faint scratching of the lawyer's pen against paper as he noted the reading. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear but with vindication, as I turned my eyes toward her and saw the smirk freeze on her lips. She blinked once, twice, as though she had misheard, as though her mind could not reconcile the words she had just been given with the fantasies she had spun for herself. Around the table, whispers began to stir, relatives exchanging surprised glances, some nodding with quiet approval, others covering their mouths in shock. Mr. Callahan continued without hesitation, clarifying that the assets were secured, untouchable by any other hands, safeguarded until the day the grandchildren were mature enough to benefit responsibly. The structure was airtight, the intent clear, and as the truth settled over the room, I watched the light drain from my daughter-in-law's face. Her back stiffened, her grip on my son's arm turned from casual possession to desperate clawing, and her eyes darted toward me, wide, furious, and disbelieving. In that instant, I saw the fragile facade of arrogance collapse into cracks of panic, the certainty of wealth dissolving into the bitter taste of exclusion. She had built her future on a foundation of greed, and now that foundation had been swept out from under her, leaving her dangling over a chasm she could not escape. My son shifted uneasily beside her, his expression clouded with something that looked like shame, but her face was a storm, disbelief twisting into anger, triumph dissolving into humiliation. For all her boasts, for all her cruel laughter, for all her mocking disrespect, she now sat powerless, confronted with the truth my wife and I had prepared long ago. The bulk of our estate was never hers to claim. It belonged to the future, to the grandchildren who carried our love and our legacy, and as the reality of it sank in, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. Justice had spoken, and her imagined victory had turned to dust before her very eyes. I will never forget the exact moment when the smirk that had mocked me through my wife's funeral finally melted away, replaced by the raw, unguarded expression of a woman who had just watched her entire illusion shatter before her eyes as Mr. Callahan's words settled into the silence. The air grew thick with tension, and all at once her composure cracked. The smug tilt of her chin faltered, her lips trembled as though searching for a new performance to play, and then her face crumbled entirely, collapsing under the weight of truth. Tears welled up, not the tears of grief for a mother-in-law lost, but the hot, bitter tears of a woman who realized she had been cut off from the fortune she had so brazenly claimed in whispers and boasts. I saw her shoulders stiffen, her back arched defensively, as if she could physically resist the reality pressing down on her, but nothing could stop it now. The lawyer's steady voice had carried more finality than any argument she could muster, and all her confidence, all her arrogance, dissolved into frantic despair. Her hands shook as she dabbed at her eyes, the tissue crumpling under the force of her grip, her tears spilling down her cheeks in streaks that smeared the carefully painted mask she had worn like armor. For years she had dismissed us, sneered at our sacrifices, rolled her eyes at the values we lived by, and now here she was, undone by the very foresight of the woman she had disrespected to her last breath. The irony was sharp enough to taste, and though I did not smile, though I kept my face calm and unreadable, inside me there was a quiet triumph, a vindication as clean and cutting as a blade. She wept as though something precious had been stolen from her, when in truth it had never belonged to her at all. The estate was secured for the grandchildren, untouched by her grasping hands, and, as the realization grew in her mind, her sobs became sharper, angrier, the sound of a woman mourning not a person, but a lifestyle that would never be hers. Around the table, the family shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other, others watching in silence as her facade collapsed. My son sat beside her, his face pale, his eyes cast downward, unable or unwilling to meet mine, his hand limp under her desperate clutch. The room was heavy with the sound of her broken pride spilling out in tears, and though I said nothing, though I let the moment unfold without interruption, inside I could hear my wife's voice, calm and certain, reminding me that this was why we had made our plan, why we had fought to protect our legacy. Her smile had faded at last, her mask destroyed, and all that remained was the bitter truth she could no longer deny. She had been cut off, and nothing she did now could change it. The tears that streaked her face soon gave way to rage, her sobs twisting into sharp, venomous words that filled the lawyer's office with a bitterness so raw it silenced the room. She slammed her palm against the table, her voice rising above the steady hum of the air conditioner, no longer bothering to mask her true self behind false politeness. "This is betrayal," she spat, her eyes blazing as they locked onto me with a fury she could no longer conceal. "After everything we've done, after everything I've put up with from this family, you dare to cut us out like this? You dare to humiliate me in front of everyone?" Her voice cracked, not with grief, but with the indignation of entitlement denied, and her accusations tumbled out in a torrent. She spoke of years of tolerating our ways, of enduring what she called our old-fashioned values, of biting her tongue when what she truly wanted was for us to step aside and let her take control. Her words dripped with contempt, painting herself as the victim while revealing the ugliness that had always lurked beneath her carefully constructed facade. Each accusation she hurled only exposed her selfishness more plainly, stripping away the veneer she had worn for so long. "I deserve it," she cried, her voice shrill, her hands clutching at my son's arm as if dragging him into her fury would lend weight to her cause. "We deserve it. We were supposed to inherit everything. Do you think I married into this family to get nothing? Do you think your sacrifices give you the right to rob me of what is mine?" The words hung in the air like poison, and I saw the faces of my relatives harden, some with disbelief, others with quiet disgust. What she thought was a righteous defense revealed itself as greed laid bare, a confession of motives that could no longer be denied. Even my son shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, his eyes avoiding mine as though he could not bring himself to share in her venom. I said nothing, letting her rant echo around the room, letting every word she hurled coil around her like the chains of her own downfall. The lawyer remained stoic, his pen resting calmly on the folder, as though her tantrum were nothing more than the noise of a child denied a toy. The power she thought her outburst carried only exposed her desperation, her belief that raising her voice could somehow rewrite the ink of a document crafted with care and sealed with law. And as she raged, calling me heartless, calling me cruel, accusing me of betraying her as though she had ever offered loyalty to betray, I sat still, my silence a mirror reflecting her selfishness back to her. The room was filled with the truth at last, not in the reading of the will, but in her own words, which revealed her for what she had always been, an ingrate whose hunger for wealth had blinded her to the love and sacrifice that had made it possible. When her tirade finally began to run out of breath, when her voice cracked from the strain of rage, and the silence of the room pressed down heavier than her words ever could, I straightened in my chair and let the stillness settle before I spoke. My heart pounded in my chest, but my voice emerged calm, even, deliberate, the kind of tone that carried weight not through volume but through certainty. "Everything my wife and I built," I said slowly, my eyes never leaving hers, "was built with sacrifice, with love, with every ounce of strength we had to give. And we built it for those who deserved it, those who understand what it cost, those who respect the meaning of hard work, those who cherish family rather than mock it." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. And for the first time her fury faltered, her mouth opening as though to interrupt, but no sound coming out. I let the silence stretch before continuing, my voice steady, measured, each word cutting through the tension like a knife. "We did not spend our lives working ourselves to the bone so that someone could laugh at our struggles. We did not give up our own dreams so they could be treated like nothing. We did not endure hardship after hardship so that our memory could be spat on by greed. My wife deserved better than your smirks at her coffin. She deserved better than your whispers mocking her life's work. And I will not allow her sacrifices or mine to be turned into trophies for someone who never respected them." Around the table, I felt the air shift, the family members leaning in, their eyes flicking between us, the weight of my words sinking deep. My son sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor, his wife clinging to him but shrinking ever so slightly under the force of my calm resolve. I did not raise my voice, I did not lash out, for I knew rage would only give her more to grasp onto. Instead, I let the strength of truth speak for itself, the quiet certainty of a man who had given everything and would no longer allow it to be mocked. "The estate belongs to those who will honor it," I said finally, my voice soft but firm. "Not to those who see it as a prize, not to those who scoff at the sacrifices that made it possible, and certainly not to those who celebrate death as if it were a door to wealth." I leaned back in my chair, my expression composed, and let the silence fall once more, watching as the weight of my words crushed whatever defiance she had left. The moment my words settled into the silence, the room seemed to fracture under their weight, and almost instantly it erupted into a low storm of whispers. Relatives leaned toward one another, their voices hushed, yet sharp with shock and judgment, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring their approval at the justice that had finally been laid bare. The sound was a chorus of truth catching fire, spreading quickly, filling the space with a mixture of sympathy for me, admiration for my wife's foresight, and disgust for the arrogance that had just been exposed. My son sat frozen at my side, his face pale, his eyes darting from me to his wife, torn between the loyalty of blood and the shame of knowing exactly how she had carried herself. His shoulders hunched as though the weight of her humiliation was pressing down on him, and though he did not speak, the silence of his guilt was louder than any words. Beside him, my daughter-in-law could no longer hold her mask together. Her face was blotched with tears and fury, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths as the eyes of the family closed in on her, their whispers cutting her more deeply than my calm response ever could. She tried to speak again, to summon another argument, but the air was no longer hers to command. The authority had shifted, and she found herself shrinking under the collective judgment now fixed upon her. With a sharp scrape of her chair against the polished floor, she shot to her feet, her voice cracking as she hurled one last bitter accusation. "You'll regret this," before storming toward the door. The slam echoed through the office, a hollow sound that reverberated like the final note of a performance that had ended in disgrace. My son remained seated, his head lowered, his hands trembling slightly as though caught in chains of indecision, but he did not follow her immediately, too consumed by the shame of what had unfolded. The whispers grew louder in her absence, relatives shaking their heads, some even muttering aloud about how they had suspected her greed all along, while others placed a hand gently on my shoulder in quiet solidarity. I sat still, my face calm, my breathing steady, the storm within me finally quieting as the vindication I had waited for began to take shape around me. She had stormed out humiliated, stripped of her arrogance, her entitlement, her illusions, and though my son bore the weight of shame, the truth had been revealed for all to see. My wife's sacrifices had been protected, her memory honored, and in the fallout of her humiliation, justice had finally taken its rightful place at the table. When the echoes of her slammed exit finally faded and the room began to quiet, I felt a stillness settle inside me unlike anything I had known since the day my wife's illness first began to steal her away. For the first time in what felt like years, the weight pressing on my chest eased, and though grief still lived there, it was no longer tainted by helplessness. Justice had been served. My wife's memory, which she had guarded with such love and dignity through every season of her life, had been protected from the mockery of greed. No longer would her sacrifices be dismissed as worthless. No longer would her tireless devotion be reduced to the coin purse of an ingrate who dared to smirk at her coffin. Her name, her work, her legacy, they were safe, preserved not only in the hearts of those who truly loved her, but in the legal shield we had built together long before death came knocking. As I sat there in the aftermath, surrounded by family who now understood the truth, I thought of my grandchildren, their innocent faces untouched by the corruption of entitlement. Their future was secure, their paths lit by the stability my wife and I had spent decades constructing, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that our sacrifices would blossom into opportunities they could cherish. They would inherit not only the fruits of our labor, but the lesson that respect, humility, and gratitude mattered more than greed, a lesson their grandmother would have wanted them to carry for the rest of their lives. My daughter-in-law's humiliation had been swift and complete, her illusions shattered before the very people she had tried to impress, and though I took no joy in her suffering, there was a grim sense of justice in watching her stripped of the arrogance that had poisoned our family for so long. She had been forced to reveal her true self, and in doing so had lost everything she thought she controlled. That was her doing, not mine, and the irony of it was as sharp as any blade. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought of my wife, of her smile, of the nights we had whispered plans to each other in the quiet of our room, of the last time she had pressed her hand into mine and told me to be strong. I felt her presence then, calm and steady, as though she was sitting beside me, her spirit finally at peace. I had kept my promise to her. I had guarded what we built. I had ensured that love triumphed over greed, that dignity triumphed over arrogance, and that sacrifice triumphed over selfishness. And as I opened my eyes again, I felt not only vindicated, but renewed, a man who had faced betrayal and grief, yet emerged with justice as his companion. The ingrate had been stripped of her illusions, my grandchildren had been given their rightful inheritance, and my wife's memory shone untarnished, a light that would never be dimmed. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.